we place value in being a member of. So we see a lot in different circumstances, whether it's in labor situations, in the workplace, in the education sector, when people choose where to go to college, where individual students, employees have to decide between this external group pressure to kind of stay where they are and this internal identity pressure to pursue interest, to advance themselves further. So to give you just some context that some of you all may be familiar with, especially this first one, if you teach freshmen and sophomores here at WVU, the idea of these first-gen college students having to move away from low-income regions, right? I've only been teaching at WVU this is my second year on the faculty now, and I've had many conversations with undergrads who come and sit in my office and tell me they like being at WVU, they're happy here, they're doing well, they think it's going to be good for their long-term outcomes, but they have this constant pressure to go back home. And home is almost always a very low-income county of West Virginia, Maryland, or one of those other surrounding states. And usually they were one of the only people from their high school class to go to college or move away from college, and they're often the first one in their families to go to college. So they're grappling with this like internal struggle. It's like, I identify as a mountaineer and I want to stay on campus, but I have a hard time staying here when everyone wants me to go home. Some other examples that we look at: women having to move into male-dominated spaces for advancement. This is mostly seen in kind of the work setting, where women have to move into very male-dominated fields. We see this a lot in the STEM fields and economics as well. Students of color attending a PWI rather than an HBCU or a Hispanic serving institution. Oftentimes, the HBCUs, Hispanic serving institutions, and other types of minority serving institutions, they have less funds available for scholarships. So students of color are often put in this predicament where they want to culturally go to one of these schools that serves their identity background, but they end up going to PWI often for financial reasons. And then the last one is people of color taking employment in racial and ethnically homogenous areas. This one's a personal one for me, obviously coming to West Virginia. It's one of the most ethnically homogenous states, if not the most ethnically homogenous state in the United States. But it's also a Tier 1 research university. It has a very strong faculty, it has a strong economics department. So this is just another example of times when individuals are going to have to kind of grapple with the internal struggle of identify with one way, but I'm going to have to be in a situation where no one is going to necessarily share my identity. Okay. Now, like I mentioned, the idea of group identity is not new to social sciences. It is new to economics, though. Right? Social psychologists have been studying identity formally since the 50s. There are a lot of different thoughts of it. There's a lot of research published already on individual identity, social identities, group identities, in and out group theories. And then what economics kind of did is economics came along and we started applying experimental testing to identity, right? So we started putting people in the lab, we started using field interventions to really, really emphasize people's identities and see how it changed their behaviors. But as I mentioned, economics, and this is pretty common with econ in general, when there's something that the social sciences have been going at for a while, econ usually comes in 20 or 30 years late, right? The first major paper on identity in economics wasn't published until the year 2000. Right. When you consider that psychology and sociology started looking at this 50 years prior, we were pretty late to the game. And even now, running identity experiments and publishing identity work is not super common. It's become more established, but it still isn't really common. It takes a long time for these papers to get through the publication process. Right. So just to give you a little timeline on how this has developed in econ, like I mentioned, the first formal paper was published in 2000, Akerlof and Cranton, called Identity and Economics. And it wasn't really even an empirical paper, it was just a theory. It basically took the theories that were worked on in sociology and psychology and formalized them in mathematical modeling. Shortly after, empirical studies started coming out in labor and education. Akerlof and Cranton came back around in 2002, did a whole paper on how identity impacts education. And they also had another paper that came out shortly after that looked at identity in the labor market. And then Fryer and Torelli came out with an empirical study of the acting white phenomenon and looked at how high school students were investing in education based on their identity backgrounds. And then in 2009, Yan Chen and Sherry Lee did their first major experiment on group identity. And just for context and bias, Sherry Lee was my advisor in grad school. All right. But they did a large experiment looking at how group identity started affecting people's decision making when they were doing in different investment games. So, where my research is fitting into this is I'm taking identity one vector at a time. What that means is previous looks at identity and economics were essentially just looking at the differences in demographics of data that already existed, right? So people would look at economic phenomenon that happened in the market or in education settings, and they'd be like, okay, but what were women doing? What was the Black community doing? What were Hispanics doing? Rather than kind of taking this afterthought, this kind of ex post approach, my research is we are specifically targeting one type of identity at a time, intentionally ex ante, so that way we can say like, yes, this is the causal mechanism behind this change in behavior, right? And that brings me to the next point of explicitly testing the identity versus just characteristics. The important distinction here is there may be, for example, biological or cultural or ethnic differences in the way people behave because of how they've been raised, for example, right? People from Appalachia behave a certain way because they were raised a certain way versus people from New York versus people from the Deep South. Those are characteristics. Those are things that are part of a culture of behaviors. Identity is how people behave in order to stay true to that culture, right? So it's one thing for me to say, so me personally, I lock my door every night when I come into the house because I grew up in the inner city, right? That's something that was trained into me and just part of the culture of growing up in the inner city. But me making a decision to act a certain way to show that I'm from the inner city, maybe I dress a certain way or I talk a certain way, that is me actually identifying with the culture, okay? And the last thing, this is kind of a pet peeve of mine with a lot of social science research, particularly from coming out of the United States, is disaggregating poor aggregation. This is something that I had a lot of issues with when I was in grad school in Arkansas, where I would see researchers just blanket all Latinos together, right? Me and myself, I'm Puerto Rican. I'm married to a Mexican woman. Our cultures, even our Spanish, are very different. So not just grouping things together just because they seem somewhat similar, actually taking the time to analyze them at a more granular level. Okay. So if you check out for the rest of this talk, I'll give you some of my upfront results right now. In this one, we're going to be focusing on the gender identity question. So just upfront, in the experiment, we find that women are more loyal than men. One of the biggest drivers of people cooperating with their identity groups is the ability to communicate with their identity groups. And then people don't necessarily change their behavior just because they see other people doing better. What that basically means is if my group is dysfunctional, but I see the other group is doing really well, it doesn't make my group more functional all of a sudden. Okay, so just in case you check out for the rest of the talk, you know what the punchline is. Okay, so just a couple key concepts. I'm going to go over these again as I go through the slides, but this is just recognizing that a lot of people may not have a background in experiments or economics or even the social sciences period. I just want to make sure that the key concepts were explained up front, so that way when we go over them again throughout the talk, that no one is too confused or lost. All right. So the first one is an anagram. You guys may or may not have played anagrams before. It's just you have a bunch of letters. You have to unscramble the letters to make a word. All right. Next one, public goods game. This is going to be a key component of the design for this. So public goods game, it's basically an activity where you have a group of people, maybe 4 or 5 people, and every round these people get some amount of money, and they have the choice to make to either keep the money to themselves, or they can put the money in like a public pot, right, like a group account. Anything that goes into that group account gets multiplied and then evenly distributed between everybody in the group. Okay. There's obviously the best way for everyone to make money in the public goods game is that everyone contributes everything. But the best way for an individual to make money is to keep all their money to themselves and just collect everyone else's money after the goods are distributed. Okay. An economic experiment, many people are not familiar with economic experiments, but it's just a way for us to test behavior in a controlled environment. All economic experiments are incentivized with cash. So when we test these things in a laboratory setting, the participants are paid in cash right afterwards, and their payment is completely based on their performance during the experiment. So they might get $5 for showing up on time, but after that, there's another $15 that they can earn potentially based on the decisions they make. And a key distinction of economic experiments versus other experiments in the social sciences is that economic experiments do not allow for deception in any way. We cannot lie to the participants. The rules have to be made very clear, and they cannot be changed without telling the participants that they're changing. Okay. Whenever I mention treatments, I'm just saying that we are changing the parameter of the game that the participants are playing in. So, right, an example of that could be for some people, they have the ability to talk to their teammates. For other people, they can't talk to their teammates. That would be two different treatments. And then the last term is endowment. And endowment is just another way of saying some amount of income that people receive during the experiment. Okay. They don't necessarily have to earn it, it's just given to them. Okay, so this is just a graphic of how we're going to flow through the experiment. Participants will first receive instructions, then they'll get to do an anagram phase with their team, they'll move on to a public goods game, and then they'll get through a post survey. Okay. So the experiment's going to take part in two stages. The first stage is the anagram stage, like I mentioned. The anagram stage is done in teams, so people can work together. It's kind of like the grad school idea. You can all do the homework together, but you have to submit your own answers at the end. Then they're going to go into the public goods game. The players are going to be in teams for all stages of this game, so they're always going to be working with somebody. Okay. The teams will initially be gender homogenous. That means there's going to be a team for the men and a team for the women, right? As far as gender identity goes, we placed individuals into their gender teams based on however they responded to the pre-survey before they started the experiment. So people had the option to self-identify their gender. We did not get anyone identifying outside of man or woman. So there's no protocol for any other genders because we didn't have anyone in the subject pool that matched that. They did have the option though of self-entering. And teams are initially made of 4 participants. So every session of this, there were 8 people in total split into these 2 teams. This entire experiment takes place over Zoom and in an online interactive environment. I'm sorry if you hear my cat yelling. I cannot control where she goes in the house. If I close the door, she's going to be yelling at the door. So the entire experiment happens over Zoom. This experiment was initially supposed to happen in person in the lab, and then COVID hit. And so we had to figure out a way to make this all happen online. So let me just briefly describe what the rules for the Zoom were. Basically, in order to get paid for their participations, subjects had to log into a Zoom call. They had to keep their cameras on and their microphones muted during the entire call. All chat functions in Zoom were disabled except for their ability to chat with the host. So that was either myself or one of the research assistants. And they could not log out of the Zoom until they logged out of the experiment. The experiment happened in a separate window through their web browser. We programmed it in Python. And if there was a mismatch where they logged out of Zoom before they logged out of the experiment, then they would not receive payment for the experiment. Okay. And so the reason we did this is because, right, we're talking about identity. We wanted the participants to see each other. We wanted them to know, to see, to confirm, like, yes, I can identify who my team members are regarding, like, initially based on gender. I know that these are real people. These are not bots, which does happen sometime in experiments that people are playing with bots. These are all real people, and I can see them struggling to make their decisions, all that good stuff, right? It brings a level of like closeness and reinforces how salient these identities are. Okay. These participants are all University of Arkansas undergraduate students. Okay. They were age 18 to 23. Over 90% of the sample was traditional college age students. They came from a variety of different states, mostly in the geographic Southeast. Majority were Arkansas and Texas. And they were all US citizens for accounting reasons. Okay, so step one, anagram stage. So participants would solve 20 anagrams with their teams. For all sessions and all treatments of the experiment, they all were able to communicate with their teammates throughout the entire thing, as far as the entire thing being the anagram stage. The anagrams got progressively harder. So the first 7 anagrams were 5 letters, the next 7 were 6 letters, and the last 6 were 7 letters. So it get progressively harder. There's a 5-minute time limit on this entire stage, and players would receive a fixed bonus for every anagram they get correctly. So we're incentivizing here. Like I mentioned before, the rules are everyone can work together as far as within your own team, but you have to submit your own task. So we'll see a lot of people like typing in like, oh, like number 1 is blank, who has number 2, so on and so forth. And then all the anagrams within a single team are identical. So everyone on the women's team and everyone on the men's team respectively have the same exact anagrams. And again, the point of the anagram stage here is to start building the team cohesion. We get them familiar with the chat function of the experiment, and they start trusting each other as far as asking each other for help and helping each other. And like I said, this is for real money. So they're helping each other earn real money throughout this process. This is what the anagram stage looks like. So they would just click on each number when they're ready to go to that anagram. Down where it says none me in the chat box, that would, for the actual experiment, that would pop up with a number. So the players were numbered 1 through 8. And they were told in the beginning that players 1 through 4 were all from the women's team, players 5 through 8 are all for the men's team, or vice versa. It was randomized each time. So they can tell by the person's number what their gender is, right, from the beginning. But like I said, in the anagram stage, everyone's staying with their gender homogeneous teams. And then during the actual experiment, we didn't label them men's team and women's team. We labeled them team A and team B, and I'll explain a little bit more on that in a minute. Okay, so after they finish the public goods game, after they finish the anagram stage, they go ahead and start the public goods game, right? So I explained in the beginning the basic public goods game. We have this idea that people all have money and they can contribute into this community pot. If they contribute to the community pot, it gets multiplied, evenly distributed, people make more money. Or they play selfish and they keep money to themselves. And then whatever they keep to themselves, they keep, right? You can split up the money. So if you have like $100, you can select any amount to keep to yourself and any amount to contribute to the group account. What we do with this is we put a little spin on the public goods game. Okay, so each team is playing a public goods game with themselves, right? Team A and Team B do not cross during the experiment as far as the public goods game goes. Okay, every round after that round is over and people have decided how much they want to contribute, they get a preview screen, which I'll show you in a second, that shows how well the other team did, right? So they'll see side-by-side comparison of how well my team did, how well the other team did, right? Like I said, the initial teams are formed around these pre-existing gender identities, and we pre-randomize the endowment ranges. So what I mean by that is each team, say Team A, they would get a range of 150 to 300 units, okay? And that means that each round, anyone on team can receive any amount of endowment between 150 and 300, as an example. People on the same team, they will receive different endowments within the same round, but they'll always be within that range. One of the teams, though, is going to have a better range than the other team. So one team is going to be receiving more money, essentially, to play the game with. That is pre-randomized before they even sit down and start the session. Sometimes it's men, sometimes it's the women's team, and but the ranges are fixed. So it's just a matter of who gets the better range, who gets the worse range. And then this play is going to go on for 20 rounds. So they're going to have to make these decisions 20 rounds. Each round, they're going to get another endowment boost. Okay. That table on the bottom, MPCR by team size, what this is basically saying is that first row, the multiplier factor is the important row. That is how much the group account, that group pot, is being multiplied by before it's distributed back to all the team members. And as you can see, the more team members your team has, the bigger multiplier factor you get. Okay, so we're starting to build this scenario where your membership on your team is becoming more and more important from a financial sense. Okay. All right, so this is what it looks like when the participants were making their decisions, right? Up top, we show them what their endowment is for that round, okay? We let them know how many people are on their team and what the team multiplier is. So how much their group account is going to be multiplied by before it's redistributed to everybody, right? We then remind them what the rules are as far as how much they earn each round. Okay, it's the amount of points you decide to keep added to whatever your return is from the group account. Okay, this is the same chat function that we had in the anagram stage where people can communicate within their teams only. And then at the bottom, they decide how much they want to contribute. Right? Not all people will have access to the chat. I'll explain a little more about it in a moment, but basically the idea is that some are going to be able to chat, some are not going to be able to chat. Okay. And this is an example of that side-by-side comparison results page I mentioned. All right, so in this individual's on team A, so they will see how much their endowment was. And then next to that, they'll see what the range was for the other team's endowment. So this individual, for example, is going to immediately know that they are on the lower endowed team. Right? We'll show them what their contribution was, and then we'll show them the team's contribution to the public good account. That is how much their team in total contributed to that public pot. They'll see theirs and they'll see team B's, right? And the idea here is that even though they know that their team is getting less of an endowment, that stark difference, like for example here, between 405 and 1450, that's a big difference, right? So we want people to see that and to see like how much more the other team is making. And then the second to last line, the earning from public goods account, it shows how much each person on their team got back from that public pot, and then how much people on the other team got back from their public pot. And then the bottom line is just showing what their total earnings were for that round. Okay, so this is the big twist that we put on this game. Every 3 rounds, we let people try to switch teams. Okay, this is to simulate the idea that people growing up in a situation where they have a lower endowment naturally because of their neighborhood, their gender, their race, their region, whatever, they will get opportunities to leave. So that's what this is simulating. But in order to switch teams, you have to be voted into your new team. You can't just decide I want to switch and then get to switch. There's a process you have to be voted in. Okay. When you apply to switch teams, the other team that you want to join is going to know your entire background as far as how much you've been contributing to your current team. Okay. The other kind of kicker here is whenever you try to switch teams, your current team is going to get feedback on that. They're going to know by your player number that you attempted to switch and if you were successful or unsuccessful. Right? So if you try to switch teams and the other team votes to not accept you, then you're going to get kicked back to your original team and your entire original team is going to know that you tried to leave. Okay? We capped the team sizes at 6 participants. The reason being is because in the early pilots of this, a lot of sessions, people would end up with like 7 on one team, 1 on the other, and then they would just take the last person just so they maximize profits. We wanted to make this, we want to have, basically make this like a decision they actually had to make because they would only get 6 people, so they had to choose wisely. And this way we can keep the play going for the full 20 rounds. Okay. So if someone's requesting to join your team, this is the screen that you would see. Again, where it says none down there under player ID, it would have a player number, so you would know the gender of the person trying to join your team, and it would list out how many points they've been contributing on average in the past rounds, and what percent of their endowment they've been contributing on average. And then you select if you want to vote them in or not. If you're in a chatting treatment, then you get to talk to your teammates about this decision. Okay. So I mentioned a lot about treatments. So here they are broken down. There were two different treatments that we were testing here. The first one was whether the identity was salient or not. What that means is before they started the game, we would give them a survey in the experiment, asking them a whole bunch of gendered questions. In this situation, we specifically related them to their living environment. So we asked questions about preferences for single-sex floors, mixed gender suites, things like that. And we asked them to give reasoning of why they prefer to live in a setting of single gender or co-ed. If they were not part of that salient identity treatment, then they had to fill out a survey about their current satisfaction with their cell phone provider. And the idea there is just equal amount of work for everybody. Okay. All right. The other treatment was communication. So if you're in the communication treatment, then you had a chat box available to you throughout the entire experiment, which means you could always talk to your teammates about decisions. The non-communication treatment only had the chat box available through the anagram stage, and after that, they would never talk to their teammates again. They'll obviously see each other's actions. They'd see each other's if they try to switch teams and voting results and stuff, but they couldn't actually discuss any of that. Okay. We test a lot of things in this experiment, but I narrowed it down for the purposes of this talk to just kind of focus on the two biggest ones. What were the effects of the treatments, and what were the effects on gender? And these initial hypotheses were based on the previous literature in experimental economics looking at these things. So just to kind of give you a quick background, previous experiments looking at things like public goods games and other cooperation type games, we always find that when people have the ability to communicate with each other, they almost always do better as far as being cooperative and increasing team profits. And with priming, we were following this idea that people within an in-group are more likely to want to cooperate than if they're from opposite groups. As far as the gender effects, we have found the economic literature has already shown that women tend to be a lot more team-oriented and much more willing to volunteer for things for the betterment of the group. So based on that, we hypothesized that there would be less likely to leave their teams. But the interesting question we had was, how does that look when they are primed to think about their gender versus just when they're acting off of this, what many would argue is a socially learned behavior. Okay, so just to reinforce that initial thing I told you guys about chat, the top two lines, those blue and green lines, those are our chat treatments. The bottom two lines, those are our non-chat treatments. And this is the percentage of their endowment that people are contributing each round to that public account. There's a clear break between them, right? But what we're going to get into more is what happens when we interact this with the priming idea and people are being reminded of their gender, and what happens when it comes to the voting aspects. Okay. So the first test that we look at here is how much people are contributing from their endowment based on which treatment they're in. Okay, this is a fixed effects model. And so the big one here, this is directly from that graph that you just saw, is that there's a huge increase in the amount of contribution that people do in chat. All these coefficients are in terms of percentages, so one would be 100%. So this is a 20% increase, essentially. Okay. A couple of things that are somewhat interesting from this that we see are mimicking the real world. If you look down to where it says Z endowment, that is looking at what percentage of people's wealth they are contributing as their wealth increases. And what that negative sign is basically telling us is that as people get more wealth, they contribute less of a percentage of that wealth to the public good, right? we're talking a decrease of like anywhere from 1.6 to 2.7% of their wealth as they get more. And then the only other thing that was really stood out from this test is looking at the kind of reinforcement of people's contribution decisions based on what their own team is doing and what the other team is doing. And what we see here is that when people see that their team is contributing a lot more, then they're more likely to contribute more. It becomes this positive cycle, right? But that means that the inverse is also true. When they see their team is not contributing, they're being selfish, then this cooperative strategy starts unraveling to this equilibrium of like everyone's just going down to zero. All right. So the next thing that we looked at then was, okay, so we know that people are more likely to contribute more when they can talk to each other. That's fine. We're not surprised by that. And yeah, if my team is all being cooperative and we're all getting along, then I'm going to keep contributing more until someone tries to betray me. There's nothing surprising about that. So then we looked at, okay, what about the switching teams? And this was really the big thing that we were interested in with this project, right? Because it's not just about how much am I willing to contribute within my own identity. There's a lot of empirical research on that. The question here is, when there is money to make by me leaving, do I leave, right? Do I go somewhere else, knowing that when I leave, that my current group is going to be worse off because their multiplier is going to go down, okay? So to kind of decode some of this, the first thing I want to draw your attention to is that coefficient on female, okay? So here, what we're finding is even when women are in the lower endowment group, they are still less likely to leave their team. They're less likely to try to leave their team, I should say, okay? This is just attempting to switch teams, right? So this is modeled using a fixed effects logit. So we're looking at probabilities of people, the log odds of probabilities of people leaving their teams. So women are just less likely to try to leave their team in general, okay? But what's curious here is that when people are just exposed to chat or they are just exposed to the priming, they end up more likely to leave their teams. And this kind of threw us for a loop until we started analyzing what the chat was actually saying, right? But if they had chat and prime going on, then it kind of neutralized itself out and they weren't trying to leave as much anymore, right? So to start unraveling some of the story, we looked at, okay, conditional on someone trying to leave their team, what's the likelihood that they're actually successful, right? Remember, I said, in order for someone to leave their team, they had to first indicate they wanted to leave, and then two, they had to actually get voted in, right? So we go back for a second, we see women are far less likely to try to leave their teams, but when they do try to leave, they're more successful at it, okay? There's two possible explanations for this. The first one is that they're just more patient. They don't try to leave until they know they have the numbers to try to leave. And for them, it's not a kind of first strategy. For them, it's a later strategy. They'll stick it out longer to try to build wealth for the team before they go out on their own. That's the first potential mechanism. The second potential mechanism is that the men are just willing to take anyone to increase their multiplier, whereas the women might be more strategic about who they let onto their team. Okay. For context, almost all of the team switching happened in the first half of the experiment. So there were 20 rounds, which means that there were 6 switching rounds. Usually by the third switching round, which would have been round 9, it's usually the last round we see actual switching. As the rounds progress, it becomes harder and harder to switch because there's significantly less places for people to go, and they start falling into an equilibrium. Okay. The other thing is we also find an interactive effect that when people are primed, but they also have the ability to chat, they're also more successful in switching teams. So when they go in with the idea of they know who they are, but they get to talk to the other people in their group, then they are usually much more strategic about when they switch. All right, so the way we start to unravel this is we look at the chat. Okay, all the chat from the communication treatments and all the anagram, we had access to all that data, and so we started questioning: are these results chat driven? Meaning, is it just because they have chat available that these results are happening, or is it going the other way around, where we can learn something from the chat about what's actually motivating the participants? Okay, so a couple of things we find: the gendered language needs to be focused on the men. Men talk about themselves a lot, and the women also talk about the men. Okay, and the rate of this language is opposite of the identity cohesion. Okay, so I'm going to explain more of that in a second. And then gendered-based gaming is more practiced by women, but not at a significant level. What I mean by gendered-based gaming is women are more likely to be strategic about the game with gender in mind than the men are. Okay. So this next part of the slides, I just want to shout out one of my undergraduate research apprentices actually put this together. He went through all 2,000 lines of the chat, and these are just some of the highlights of the most gendered things he found. But he went through all 2,000 lines and codified every single line with the type of chat and what they were talking about. So I just want to shout out Will Turman. He's a great RA. Okay. But these are just highlights of what he found empirically as well by kind of going through this qualitative analysis. When the men are using gendered language, they're usually talking about themselves, they're pumping themselves up, they're trying to reinforce their own strategies, right? And these are just 4 bullet points. There are hundreds of these. And the majority of the men saying things like, let's go boys, we got this, we're better than this, like we can do better, like, the men great, all that. Whereas when the women were using gendered language, it was much more likely to be focused on the men. Okay, so they're referencing the men's performance a lot. They're referencing the men trying to join their team, or they were outwardly complaining about the men having a better range. Like I said before, the ranges were random, so sometimes the woman had a lower range, sometimes they had a higher range. Okay. So, but what we found in general, though, is that the women were less likely to use gendered language at all. The men were much more focused on gendered language than the women. But the women stood out because when the women were using gendered language, they were talking about the men. So it seemed more prevalent. But when we actually went through the numbers and went through the counts, this is another logit model looking at the odds. Women were far less likely to use gendered language. Okay. We also found very, very slight, but we found this very, very slight difference when people had the higher endowment. They talked more about their gender as well. Again, this is a tiny, tiny result. Okay. Some other things we find, just kind of summarizing this. Women asked each other questions at a higher rate than men, 48% more. Okay, I want to focus in on that. They asked each other questions at a higher rate. This is across the phases. So in the anagram, the women were immediately asking each other how to solve things. They had a much higher rate of trying to work together to solve the anagrams. And then also during the actual public goods game, the women were much more likely to question each other's motives, to question each other's contribution levels, to try to coordinate, right? They were much more conscious of this. Okay, and they were also much quicker to notice when they had the lower endowment range than the men did. Right, this is all from the chat, and what we based that on is how early in the game they actually reference it out loud that they had this lower endowment range. Okay. So we want to take this and put it into actual real life scenarios, and just some of the places that we think that these kind of study is applicable. One of the biggest areas is labor market pricing, wages, right? The more prevalent the salience of people's identity is when they go into job searches and wage negotiations, the more conflict you're going to have when it comes to leaving a team that I can identify with versus going to a team that is going to make me money, very simply put. And then the other big thing is this issue of education migration. And when I say issue, I mean that it's not happening as much as we would want it to happen in the labor market. This experiment was initially done in Arkansas using gender, but one of the main motivations of this is actually racial identity and socioeconomic identity, which is going to be one of the next phases of this project. And Arkansas has a somewhat unique persistence of racial segregation. And what I mean by segregation is you could draw a line across the state and you would do a very good job at separating the white population of the state of Arkansas and the black population of the state of Arkansas. It's almost a diagonal line, just cutting the state. The further northwest you go, the whiter it gets. The further southeast you go, the blacker it gets. But the problem is the highest ranked universities are in the northwest. So Black students are less likely to go to well-ranked universities because the idea of leaving their communities is really, really hard for them from an identity standpoint. So next steps we're going to do with this project, it's pretty far along, but I would not call it done by any means. We're going to start mixing teams and dynamics. So like I said, this one started off with gender homogenous teams. We also want to rule out the idea that women are just more loyal to teams in general. Even though our identity treatments show us that there's definitely an effect from the gender identity, so we're going to have some where the teams start off mixed and see what the equilibrium is there. And then we're going to also start looking at some other vectors of identity. So as I mentioned already, we want to look at racial and ethnic identity. Specifically, we want to look at white, Black, and Latino. We also want to start looking at socioeconomic background, which I think is going to be really prevalent for West Virginians and surrounding area, where socioeconomic identity has a huge impact on the way people make decisions about education and career options. And then the last two are just kind of points of interest, religious identity and Greek life. Just as a kind of, I don't want to call it a benign treatment because both are very real, but these are things that religious identity and Greek life are things that are more often chosen rather than what's endowed to you at birth, right? You're born and you grow up with a certain gender identity. You can't choose that. Race and ethnic background, you can't choose that. Socioeconomic background, you can't choose that. But religious and Greek identity, it'd be interesting to see what happens when people can actually choose their identities in real life as well. Okay, so some of the conclusions we're at so far in this project. First big one, priming doesn't significantly impact the contribution, but chat does. We already knew that going in. But something that was really interesting was seeing the parallel team do better doesn't necessarily encourage contribution either. The real world kind of parallel to this is just because I see another group, whatever group it is, behaving a certain way doesn't mean it's going to make my group change the way we behave. Okay. Female participants are much less likely to attempt to switch teams than males, but when they try to switch, they're more successful. And then, like I said, the kind of quirky result we got was when we have chat and priming mixed together and interacting, it has this opposite effect when the individual treatments ends up neutralizing the individual treatments. Okay. So since I have a couple minutes left, I wanted to go ahead and do a shameless plug. I've recently started my own research lab over in the Chambers College, the Behavioral Economics Situational Testing Lab. So if any of you have ever wanted to learn more about economic experiments or behavioral economics, or have an idea that you think would collaborate well from a behavioral economics lens, the lab right now is largely PhD student driven. And when I say largely, I truly do mean largely. Right now I'm the only faculty in the lab as the director. And we have 3 senior graduate students actively doing research and 6 junior graduate students. When I say junior, I just mean that they're still taking coursework. They haven't advanced the candidacy yet. But we are looking at a variety of different types of questions that are related to behavioral economics. A lot of our questions are looking at how different policies and different interventions are affecting marginalized communities. We have 2 projects currently working on gender, racial, and ethnic identity. One of my most senior graduate students is doing a project on discrimination in healthcare across gender and race. myself and the lead grad student for the lab, we are doing a huge field experiment across 3 different states looking at behavioral interventions and mentoring for higher education. And that's looking at this really cool idea that um, making information available isn't the same thing as making people receive your information. So if you don't package your information properly, you might as well not send it at all. You need to send it in a way that's actually digestible for people and takes into consideration that diverse perspectives of information have very, very different interpretations. And that's looking at the idea of college recruitment in marginalized communities. And then we also have a macroeconomist looking at behavioral impacts when currency and investments become unstable, how different identity groups react to that. Right. So in total, there are 9 grad students currently working in the group, and there are 4 undergraduate research apprentices that this is their part-time job, is working in the lab, and we also have a programmer to help us program any computer-based experiments. So we have quite a solid workforce to get research done if this is something that you're interested in. And here's a lovely picture of all of those graduate and undergraduate students. Like I said, this is a phenomenal team. I really can't sing their praises enough. As far as the undergrads are learning very, very quickly. I applaud them being so young in their academic careers and already diving into research. The graduate students, these are some of the most productive graduate students I could have the pleasure of working with. They are all going to likely graduate with 1 or 2 actual publications, which is very rare in economics. I understand in other fields it's much more common. In economics, it is very difficult to publish early. Most graduate students in economics graduate with 0 publications. So the fact that they're all doing policy relevant research and they're working in the community a lot too. And most of them are also involved in policy centers in Washington, D.C., at Pitt. So these are very, very active scholars in training. Okay. And that's it. There's my website and my Twitter handle if you want to see me talk about how great my students are or the cool research we're doing. And if you have any questions about the Beast Lab, you can contact me or you can contact Christine. She's the lead grad student for the lab, and I can promise you she is much faster at responding to emails than I am. So other than that, I guess we are open for questions now.
Thank you for such a phenomenal and absolutely intriguing presentation of your work, Nathaniel. I think my colleagues and I in advance will probably want to connect with you around some opportunities to kind of see some of the work that we are doing and how it may interestingly align with some of the things that you are talking about. So I'm excited for that opportunity. I will open the floor now to some questions, and I think that we have more time than I thought we would toward the end. So maybe if we could get through 3 good questions, and if we have time, we'll take a 4th. So I'm scrolling for hands up because I didn't do a Q&A, but if you want to drop something in the chat, you can also do that. But if anyone has a question that they'd like to ask, I'm just scrolling through here for hands up. Also want to draw your attention to a link I put in the chat so that you can provide Nathaniel with feedback on his talk. It's an open-ended survey, so I will, give that to him, and you can communicate what your feedback is there. So,
I have a question. I have to hop off here in just a second, but I was really fascinated. Thank you for making this accessible, for sure, because I'm a sociologist. So I was like, I don't know if I'm going to understand what he's talking about, but this is very, very fascinating. But my question was really just, and I think I kind of understand a little bit of the answer to this question, but not entirely. But why does econ specifically care about group identity, and what do some of the findings about women are more loyal than men, what does that indicate about when it relates to econ more specifically?
Yeah, so that's a great question. This is something I actually bring up to I teach principles of micro, so I teach freshmen a lot. And so I love getting to get them early so they understand the evolution of economics in this perspective. Economics historically has kind of lived off this representative agent idea where it's everyone should have the same rational thought process. We all know that doesn't work, right? Right, and in fact, I personally believe that's one of the biggest sources of unintended consequences for policy. It's what the basic idea here is you have people making policy for other groups of people that they don't understand, right? And what ends up happening is they get written off in the economic models as irrational actors, which is very frustrating, right? It's very, very frustrating. The rational economic model would say, like, yeah, everyone should try to be moving out of their parents' house. They should try to invest in their own property. They should chase whatever is the best career opportunities. But we have a very wide mix of cultures, even in this call right now. For a lot of us, we place a lot of value in living close to family. We place a lot of value in living in the same house in multiple generations. So that's just like a very stark example of why identity matters in these. Now, your question on gender identity specifically, if you read economic papers, even still today, but starting back in the 60s, you'll always see the household decision maker referred to as a woman. It's always, she will then make a decision about investing this or purchasing this. And it's based on the old traditional family model where the man made money and the woman spent the money for the household. And just as a really, really quick example, the UK actually did a study on this because the UK had a public assistance program where the money was being distributed to the bank account of the man of the house, but they found that the money wasn't being spent. So what they tried doing was distributing it to the women, and all of a sudden all the money started getting spent because, and it wasn't getting, and I don't mean that like they were spending it frivolously. I mean, they were buying clothes, food, diapers, right? So identity matters because we see, part of it might be nature. It might be the way that men and women naturally are, right? We can argue, right? You're a sociologist, you're going to know far better than I would. But there are these kind of naturally occurring behaviors we see. But part of it is nurture. Based on which culture you're from, your gender identity will dictate a lot of your decision-making processes. And so we need to start advancing our models so that they incorporate the differences in the way people identify, whether it's gender, race, culture, ethnic background, political background, whatever. If we want to understand that the way we react to policy is not going to be the same. You can't put the same policy in Morgantown, West Virginia, and expect a similar result from a policy you passed in Brooklyn, New York. And that's not just because of the size of GDP. That's because the Appalachian people are real different than New Yorkers.
Yes, we are. Yeah, for sure. For sure. Awesome. I will probably follow up, and thank you again for the talk. I probably will follow up about potentially working with your lab just because I also study religion. And so as you were talking about that being an interest, I was like, oh, like that would be interesting.
Yeah.
So I'll be in touch for sure. But thank you so much for this.
We can end the feud between sociologists and economists.
Please, let's do that. Let's do that. Have a good one.
Yep.
Tony, I'm wondering if you'd like to just say what you put in the chat.
Yeah, sure. I didn't want to interrupt Stephanie. So hi, I'm Tony. I'm a PhD candidate in the Resource Economics Department in the College of Ag. And I'm studying human and community development. And so all the master students and the pre-candidacy doc students are required to go to seminar, and they invite presentations there that are all related to economics. I didn't know if you've had the chance to share your work with the seminar over there. And if you haven't, if you would be interested, that would be super great.
No, so I have not had my chance. The only person I know over there is Heather, but I think she's moving up to bigger things soon. But no, I would love to. So just send me an email. We can try to coordinate a time for that.
Awesome, thank you.
No problem. Actually, my master's degree was in resource economics from the University of Alaska. Yeah, fun fact. If you search me, you will find a paper about reindeer floating around out there.
Thank you.
Yep.
That's awesome. I want to leave time for any other. Joseph, Joe, I see your hand up. So why don't you go ahead now?
Great, thanks, Dr. Burke. Great talk. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about the implications of this specific study for the labor market pricing for wages. So I'm drawing this conclusion that you're saying maybe women are less likely to leave their jobs. But the fact they also notice their lower endowment, are they more, when they're leaving their jobs, are they more willing to ask for higher wages somewhere else? Because that again would kind of speak against like the kind of stereotypes you might have about that. So
right. So I think that question can be best answered through the lens of like opportunity cost threshold. And one of the original titles for this project was like group identity and opportunity cost thresholds. And it's basically saying that, it's again experimentally, right? I don't want to overstate the external validity, but we're basically finding that the women were less likely to leave for incremental increases in wealth. Okay, they were more likely to stay loyal, even knowing that they were taking this small hit, which just means that in this situation, we can kind of draw this conclusion that they're valuing that group identity higher to offset the opportunity costs. But when they do switch to more successful, which implies that they just wait longer to switch, the opportunity cost has to be a lot bigger for them. And they also want to make sure that they are going to be represented the best light possible when they make the switch. We already know this from a lot of resume studies where men are just more likely to apply for stuff they're not qualified for. It's just the way it is. Empirically, women tend to make sure that they're fully qualified before they apply for a job more often. And we kind of see that mimicked here. When the women were trying to switch teams, they waited until their average endowment was just higher, right? And they waited until the wage gap was bigger. So I think the kind of parallel there is they're going to build as many skills as possible before they try to switch jobs. And they're going to make sure that switch has a big enough jump to justify the loss of that group identity to them.
Great, thank you.
Is there anyone else I am here who has a question or comment for Dr. Burke? Okay. Well, Dr. Burke, we thank you for an extraordinary first presentation in our inaugural FJN Faculty Talks. I put a link in the chat so that people can click on to our events page on our website and see the talks that are upcoming. Some of the folk who will be speaking during this semester were present here, so I ask you all to support them as they come forth and present their research and scholarship to us. I want to thank everyone for coming through. There's also a link, as I mentioned before, to provide feedback to Dr. Burke. And I see a message that just popped in. Oh, okay, great job, Nathaniel. So I'm sure you could kind of read through some of those. But on average, Provost Latimer says here, on average, women wait longer for discretionary promotions. Yes, I was waiting for you to talk because I know your research is not too far off from this work. Okay, good. So we thank you all so much for coming. Dr. Burke, again, thank you so much for what you shared with us and setting us off in a really positive way. So I think that's it. I hope as everyone has had an opportunity to speak who wanted to, and we can get to our 1 o'clock classes. All right, have a good one, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.